Thanks for the warm welcome, everyone. I'm looking forward to a good discussion. I know we've reserved a good amount of time, and sometimes I think in meetings like this, rather than me giving you a big speech the whole time, we might actually benefit from some Q&A and be able to have an actual conversation. I'll give you some background on my own life and why I'm doing what I'm doing now, and why the issue of combating the mental health epidemic in our state is a top priority for me. I grew up in Cincinnati. My parents were immigrants who traveled halfway around the world about a half century ago to Greater Cincinnati, where I went to public schools through 8th grade. I went to a school called St. X for high school. I think we have some St. X alums in the audience tonight as well. And then I became an entrepreneur. I'm not a politician by background, but healthcare was the sector that I entered. I ended up founding a biotech company called Roivant that was developing medicines in areas that larger companies have typically ignored. 5 of the medicines we developed are FDA-approved products today. One of them is actually a life-saving therapy in kids, where 100% of kids who are born with this genetic condition, congenital disease called congenital athymia, 100% of them die by the age of 3 if untreated. We worked on a therapy where 70% of those kids now live lives of normal duration. And that's one of 5 FDA-approved medicines that our company developed. And I also co-founded another company called Chapter that helps seniors navigate the unnecessarily complicated and inefficient Medicare process. So that was my background before entering politics. I often ask myself this question, my wife asked me this question, why are we doing this? And she's the real hero of the family. She's a healthcare provider herself. She's a throat surgeon at the Cancer Hospital at Ohio State. And I'll tell you why I'm running to lead this state. It is because my faith teaches me that when we have been blessed with so much, raising our kids in circumstances that neither my wife's nor my parents would have imagined when we were growing up in Greater Cincinnati a few decades ago, when we have grown up in a country that allows a kid like me to be able to grow up and lead the very state where I was born and raised, we have a moral duty to use the blessings we have been given to ensure that our kids and their generation are able to achieve even bigger things than we did. And I personally want Ohio to be the state that paves the way to reviving this quaint idea we don't even talk about anymore, this idea called the American dream. It's very personal to me. I know a lot of young people today are skeptical of that idea of the American dream, but I know it exists because I have lived it. And I think we have both an opportunity and a moral duty to pass that on. Now, I believe that one of the core issues we're going to have to confront in reviving the American dream in our country is to really fight the growing mental health epidemic, which is untenable if we let it continue to fester, especially in our youth and especially in the next generation, but also in current adults. I approach this as a businessman, where this will require some level of upfront investment. But I use the word investment rather than cost, because in the long run, we actually bear greater costs if we fail to address upfront the ways we know through early intervention and prevention and adequate treatment that we're going to be able to address a lot of the shortcomings that we face today. And so the 3 things I'd love to talk to you all about today are, number 1, destigmatization. Number 2, treatment, particularly early treatment. And number 3 is actually this idea of prevention. Right? So we shouldn't just stop at treatment, but we should think about how we prevent on the front end as well. And I'll start with destigmatization, because this is also very personal to me. My mom was a geriatric psychiatrist. She used to treat patients at the VA growing up, and then eventually worked in nursing homes in Greater Cincinnati. And one of the things that she used to impress upon me was the way in which a mental health disorder is no different than any other health disorder. And yet, if we all actually felt open talking about our respective stories, we would realize there was no reason for stigma in the first place. Not just everyone in this room, but everyone probably in most rooms that I visit is no more than 1 or 2 steps removed from someone who suffers from a mental health disorder, including in Ohio. It's about 1.9 million Ohio adults who live with a mental health condition. That's Ohio adults in a state with 11.8 million people, so that doesn't even include kids. You're looking at over 10% of the population that in some way faces an actual mental health condition. Nearly 500,000 who have a serious mental health condition, a serious version of that condition. And I would like for Ohio to be a state that leads the way in saying that we're not only allowed to talk about this, we're very comfortable talking about this. That telling the stories of those in our communities and their families being able to speak up about this is not something that should be a source of stigma, but actually a source of celebrating the fact that we're finally talking about an issue that's been swept under the rug for too long. And one of the things I'm very proud of is that we are, in some ways, leading the way with the SOAR study. I don't know by show of hands if this is something folks are familiar with in the room at Ohio State. A good number of you may know what I'm talking about here. As I mentioned, my wife works there, and I'm very familiar with a lot of the leadership that Ohio State's providing in the country. But in the realm of cardiovascular medicine, there was something called the Framingham study. It was a long-run study that looked at cardiovascular risk outcomes, so much so that when I was leading the development of drugs at my company, Roivant, we would often, for investment decisions, for even chronic kidney disease or other complications of cardiovascular disease, would look at the Framingham study, named after the place in Massachusetts that led it. Multi-decade long outcomes tied to risk factors at baseline that could predict poor outcomes. The next generation of the equivalent of Framingham to cardiovascular medicine is actually the SOAR study being conducted at Ohio State, a decade-long outcomes-based study, tying eventual mental health outcomes to early indicia where there's opportunities eventually to intervene and treat. So in some ways, we as a state, I'm proud to say, are already paving the way through data, through, in many cases, we'll come back to this de-siloing of data, through the next generation of research and looking at outcomes to destigmatize this issue of mental health so that we're actually able to talk about it. And I'm proud of what our state can continue to do. And one of the things that we know we're going to see in the results of that SOAR study, we already see it today, is that this is an epidemic that does not particularly discriminate across race, gender, class, or for that matter, political party. Right? I think this is something that affects across socioeconomic strata. This is a fundamental issue. Families facing the risks of schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder. That's one of the things that we're seeing already is the broad demographic base, and the Ohio State-led SOAR study is going to shed a lot more light on this in a way that matters in the years ahead. Now, before we get to treatment, I want to talk about prevention as a goal in and of itself. One of the areas where I think we have a major opportunity to lead the way is by equipping our schools to be the front line source of preventing the progression of mental health disease by often training our teachers, our counselors, and other educational providers in our schools to be able to spot those early signs and to be able to work hand in hand, both with childhood primary care and eventually adult primary care, to intervene early, to include and embrace the role of the family, something that we'll talk about hopefully in the Q&A as well, to a system that doesn't just look at treating on the back end, where someone is in a case of a severe complication, God forbid, showing up in a hospital, but on the front end, understanding where early intervention and early family and community engagement can actually make a difference. And this is an area where I believe our schools, including our public schools, can actually make a difference. And I think that early intervention is something that requires greater investment and cost to something that would actually be a great ROI over the long run. I mean, I'm looking at some statistics that in recent days we've been refreshing ourselves on this. 1 in 5 homeless Ohioans currently suffer from a serious mental health illness. So you think about the homelessness issue that's addressed in a silo. If you're looking at the homeless issue without looking at the mental health epidemic, you're actually missing the heart of the point. You think about the criminal justice system. The number of people who end up in prison, the costs that we could avoid if we actually are able to prevent and treat early, that's something that is squarely in the remit of a well-run state government to actually fix. And that's something I'm committed to and want to hear from you about what else we can do through early detection, prevention, starting at a young age. That's something that if we invest up front will actually save us long-run costs. The other thing I want to do is ensure that every patient who does suffer from a mental health condition is able to access treatment. And that includes an abundance of healthcare providers, including mental health care providers, where I believe that government obstacles do, with the best of intentions often, get in the way. I want to talk to you and understand from you how we're able to cut some of that red tape, not only the licensure and bureaucratic obstacles to become a licensed mental health provider, but also to collect reimbursement as a mental health provider. We have a shortage of people who are otherwise would be well equipped to address this crisis, but who aren't able to offer their service because of the ways in which we create obstacles for somebody to be able to, A, become a licensed mental health service provider, but also we can talk about the reimbursement obstacles as well. I'd also love to talk to you about how we're able to, over time, shift the model of reimbursement away from just paying for volume and quantity to actually a system that pays for quality and outcome for the patient. This isn't going to be easy. There's deep and difficult questions about how you measure those outcomes, what your baseline trajectory would have been. But this is where great high-quality studies, high-quality evidence, I mentioned the SOAR study earlier, but other evidence-based approaches to say that rather than paying 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 times the cost on the back end, you could pay a fraction of that cost by ensuring that someone never ends up with a serious complication. And we have a system that doesn't quite yet incentivize that. I'd like to see that change. And so ways in which, through Medicaid in particular, which the state runs, and by the way, for those who aren't aware, that is the single largest budget item in running the state of Ohio. How are we able to have a Medicaid model to address mental health that at once delivers superior outcomes for our patients, but also pays less in the process because we're actually focusing on the outcome rather than quantity of intervention delivered? Some of this will require some upfront investment, including from the state. I've talked about this since day one of my campaign when we launched it in Westchester, Ohio. I like that we've got the lighting effects integrated. This is good. We had that right on cue when we're getting to solutions. The lights come on. This is the best choreographed. This is the best choreographed version of a speech I've done. So now they're being self-conscious. Now, in all seriousness, the day we launched this campaign, it was at an aerospace company in Butler County, Ohio. Anson, you were there, right? He was a St. X classmate of mine. He's running Radley Health. I think, did you speak earlier already?
Yeah.
Yeah, you were there at the opener that we did in Westchester. That day one of this campaign, said that we wanted to bring back investment in constructing psychiatric hospitals in our state, which had been shuttered for too long. And there's a downstream effect of this, because if you think about it on the front end, what I hear from our county sheriffs across the board, every one of our county sheriffs, and I've visited all 88 counties over the last year, mostly I'm listening to them. Every one of these counties, and the county sheriffs tell me, that our jails, the county jails, are the top form of psychiatric health care in their county. And they're not equipped to actually deliver psychiatric health care, because that's not their job as a county sheriff or somebody who manages the jail. And part of the problem was the shuttering of psychiatric hospitals over the last 4 decades, not just in our state, but across the country. Well, I would love for our state to set a positive example of what turning this around actually looks like. Let's rebuild some of those psychiatric hospitals. So number one point of relief is that our jails will no longer be expected or put in the unfortunate position of having to take care of mentally ill people who they're not equipped to take care of. But then downstream, the psychiatric hospitals that we do have, as you well know, are overrun. Some cases I'm told it's upwards of 90% of them are people who have committed criminal violations, which is a downstream effect of the fact that our jails are overcrowded. So if you address that issue on the front end of increasing the supply and the capacity of psychiatric health care in our state, that will both help our law enforcement, our men and women in blue who are in law enforcement on the front lines. I actually met with a group of them right here at this venue before this meeting.
That will help them do their jobs to be more effective in creating jail capacity and prison capacity for those for whom it's actually intended. Also opening up the capacity of our sheriffs and police officers to keep our streets safe. But then also open up the capacity of mental health institutions that aren't just existing for the people who break the law, but people who also need treatment, who may not have broken the law, but need treatment just the same. Now, as I said, I'm a business guy. A cost is not the same thing as an investment. And I believe in investing in the long run for Ohio's future if we're smart about it, if we're committed to outcome-based models rather than volume-based models, then we can actually be the state that sets a national example for what America's path out of this mental health epidemic is really all about. And in this process, we should reflect on, not in a blaming kind of way, but in a learning kind of way, on some of the mistakes that we might have made in getting us to where we are. For example, we know that a lot of the COVID-19 policies, the restrictive response to shutting down a lot of our economy and our schools, is directly correlated, causally correlated, with increases in depression, anxiety, and other mental health disorders. That's not to blame those who implemented those policies per se, but that is to say we will learn from those policies to say this is also a historic opportunity to turn that curve around the other way. Thankfully, God forbid, we won't have another pandemic or another senseless policy response, but we instead have an opportunity to say now that that's behind us, we do have a bolus in an increasing trend that we're actually able to bend the curve down in the opposite direction. If we're able to learn what actually works to achieve those goals, both through increased providers, both through increasing the number of psychiatric care facilities, moving to outcomes-based models in our schools with well-trained programs and school resource officers and teachers and guidance counselors, understanding how they're detecting early on a young child or student who may be at risk. And that upward increase that we've seen in the last half decade, in part as a consequence of those COVID policies, instead turn them around the other way. That will be a down payment for the next generation of ensuring that we're as successful in addressing the mental health epidemic as modern medicine has been in addressing a wide range of other ailments, from hepatitis C virus, which is now cured, to a lot of advances in cardiometabolic disease that we should celebrate. I think the next decade hopefully can be the decade of our cracking the code on how we bend the curve in the other direction on the spread of mental health disorders in the United States of America. I would like for Ohio to be the state that shows the country what is possible. I would like to do it in a way that is not penny-wise, pound-foolish, but thoughtful in how we're able to make the kinds of investments that will pay dividends in the long run, and to do it in a way that is tied to patient outcomes above all, putting the patient first. And that is what I respect and appreciate about the diverse group we have gathered here today. You all represent different parts of the healthcare system, from nonprofits to providers, to entrepreneurs, to policy leaders. But I think the one thing we have in common is that we don't want to operate in separate silos. I don't want to run our government in a way that operates in separate silos between the behavioral health department and the Ohio Department of Medicaid and local governments operating in separate silos. Let's de-silo it. Let's get common access to the same data so that we're operating from a single source of truth. Let's operate with a one Ohio mentality rather than us versus them mentality. Provider versus payer versus patient versus nonprofit. Put aside and dissolve the boundaries to say we're going to work together with a one Ohio mentality to make our state the state that creates a model for excellence in destigmatizing, preventing, and when needed, treating mental health conditions as they occur. And if we do, I think we have a great both economic opportunity, when you think about lost days at work, reducing the future prison population, enhancing the productivity of our workforce, a great economic opportunity, but also a great ethical opportunity to do what is actually right and to set a positive example that brings us together across demographic and party lines to address a problem that knows no demographic boundary. Thank you for your warm welcome. We appreciate that. And with those introductory remarks, I'd love to open this up to Q&A. Thank you again.
much. I'm a psychiatrist like your mother, so I appreciate you sharing that background. I've been a public servant psychiatrist my whole career in Ohio.
Thank you.
Very much important to me, and I'm a NAMI board member here as well for NAMI Ohio. You've said a lot, which a lot of what I like to hear, having worked in the state hospitals before they basically became actually 100% forensic at this point. So given that, it's sort of the day.
I said 90%, you said 100%?
It's 100%.
Yeah.
You can't get a civil patient in any of the hospitals at this point. So given everything you've said, what's an immediate action you think that Ohio can take that would make a big difference pretty rapidly for probably about 1 in 4 people in Ohio who actually need mental health services? You're right, they don't all get it.
Yeah.
You said about 10%. But it's sort of an immediate action. And I say Ohio, but I mean we, like all of us, but yourself and your leadership, what would be an immediate action that we could take?
I'll give you a few, okay? And I would turn the same question, maybe not even for today, but for continued engagement. We want all of you to have a seat at the table in the way we lead this state, to continue to give us ideas we're not thinking of. But I'll give you a few from my perspective. Number one is I think we do need to increase the number of qualified providers where we do have a shortage of that. And that is an area where it's not the only problem, but I do think the government's getting in the way. I think there are too many obstacles. Compared to other areas of medicine, there are too many obstacles to be able to get worthy reimbursement as a provider for treating mental health condition, just as you would treating a cardiovascular condition, a genetic condition, viral condition. Our healthcare system should not draw an artificial distinction that makes, we can call it licensure, you can call it, box checking, but the purposeful barriers that are created for someone to be a mental health care provider, bring that down and increase the supply of available tools. There's another way in which I'd also like to increase the supply of mental health care providers is to really revive the role of the family. Okay, so one of the things that I say even to audiences that are very different from the one in the room today in other settings is that some of our best social programs of all are faith, family, and a well-paying job. Okay, and I think that beats most government social welfare programs head to head if we're actually able to foster that. But what role can the government play? I think we can think about particularly, and I'm open to conversations even about thoughtful approaches to reimbursement, how much family-based care or lost wages in a different domain that go into treating a patient that actually maybe even the most effective frontline form of care. How do we orient our system to putting the family and community, but the family in particular, in a position of empowerment to help the people who they know best and are closest to be able to help them? What does primary care look like as a frontline intervention as well? We've had some success with kids. I think we want to see that same success translate into adults. So I'd say those are two things right off the bat, is increase the supply of mental health care providers, both those who are professionally able to provide by reducing the barriers for sensible reimbursement, but also to think about other pro-family approaches that allow the family to step up and to actually be able to provide care where needed. And then the other area where we would love to work with you is to define the benchmarks. This is the biggest obstacle to getting this done. But to define the benchmarks and the outcomes that allow us to transition our system to outcome-based care reimbursement rather than just volume-based care. Those are three things that I think we will be able to better do to actually serve the patients who are in need rather than just looking at increasingly bureaucratic solutions.
I appreciate your vision. Thank you.
Thank you for what you do.
I'm retired Supreme Court Justice, Evelyn Stratton, and I left the bench 12 years ago to work on this issue. I was born and raised in Thailand as a missionary kid. Came here when I was 18, so I'm living the American dream like your family. But one of the things, all the things you talked about are all things we're working on with a program called Stepping Up that tries to reverse the cycle of jail being the mental health hospital. And everyone in this room has been partners with that. But one of the things I keep running into over and over, and I've heard you talk about universities and colleges, is we don't have enough people trained. We don't have enough psychiatrists, we don't have enough low-level. We can make all these positions, but we don't have any to fill them. So what is your plan or your goal to try to increase the supply of people who can actually do the treatment and do all of those things you're talking about?
Sure, I appreciate it.
Evelyn Stratton.
And you were born in Thailand?
Yes, my parents were missionaries.
And when did you come to Ohio?
I came to America when I was 18 with $500, and I ended up on the Supreme Court. So, yes.
How about that?
Great country.
I love it. It was Ronald Reagan who said in his farewell speech, it was the final speech he ever gave to the country, you could move to Germany, but you'll never be a German. You could live the rest of your life in Italy, you'll never be an Italian. You can go to France, you wouldn't be a Frenchman. You could pack your bags and live in China or Japan, or Thailand for that matter. You would never be Chinese or Japanese or anything else. But you can come from any one of those countries to the United States of America, and you could still be an American, so long as you work hard, you play by the rules, you make your contributions, obtain your citizenship, pledge allegiance to the flag. You're every bit an American as anyone else who's ever been in this country. And that's a deeply personal story to me and to my family as well. My mom followed a similar journey to yours and took care of patients just like you did. In the legal system, she did in the medical system, and that's very personal to me. I will tell you, this is a much longer conversation about how we increase our workforce, not just in the sector of mental health professionals, but we do have a more systematic issue that we're going to address in our state. We have a declining workforce problem across the board, and so I know it doesn't come as anything other than cold comfort to you to say that mental health professionals are not the only sector in which we face this problem. We have a declining population. We have young people who are leaving the state. We have more people leave the state than move in, but the people who leave tend to be our younger educated workers. The people moving in, we love them, but they often come from our neighboring states. They tend to be on social welfare programs. So economically, that's a great challenge for our state. One of the things that I'm focused on for the long run is ensuring that our schools are actually equipping our young people to be productive members of the workforce, whatever sector they enter. Graduation should not be a participation trophy. It's something I say often, it gets me in trouble. I still say it because it's true. Our standards in science, math, reading, writing have declined. And that starts young. And this is not irrelevant to the mental health epidemic and the mental health issues as well. A child has to be able to read by the end of third grade. I think it's a mandate. It's a policy that we call the third grade reading guarantee. We actually used to have the third grade reading guarantee in Ohio. We got rid of it, and I think that was a mistake. And what it says is if you're medically capable, not if you're dyslexic or something like this, but if you're medically capable and you're able to read, if you're not able to read by the end of third grade, then you're not going to fourth grade until you can. That's the time in a child's life where they make the transition from learning to read to reading to learn. And if you make that transition, not only are you more likely to graduate successfully, enter the workforce, and have a successful, financially independent life, you're also 6 times less likely to end up in prison. You are also several-fold less likely to end up with a mental health condition as well. And there's some correlation issues to unpack, sure, but that's inherently a good thing if we're able to get there. Right now, the end of third grade literacy rate in the top 8 Ohio public school districts is 45%. So I think that there's an opportunity to ensure that our public schools are doing every bit as well as some of our private schools. I went to public schools in Cincinnati through 8th grade. I went to St. X for high school. I'll give you one example. During the COVID school closures, which were a driver of a spike in poor mental health outcomes in the 5 years since, public schools in Cincinnati public schools were closed for nearly 2 years. Well, my alma mater of St. X was closed for 5 days. Those kids in those public schools will never get those 2 years of their education back. And we can't afford to make that mistake or put people into positions of authority who made or would make those mistakes again. I think that's how you address the workforce issues for the long run, is you have an education system that works, that prepares our young people, that creates incentives for them to stay in the state. And then let's talk about mental health providers in particular. I think it needs to be an attractive profession that is compensated appropriately for the value that's actually being delivered. Value-based models will, I believe, meaningfully raise the median and mean pay of the modal healthcare provider in our state,
including mental health care provider in our state. But that's up to us to create metrics and measurements that define those health outcomes. I think that you think about, OBH, you think about the Ohio Department of Medicaid. Let's de-silo a lot of the separate government silos and ensure that we're making it easier for somebody who has the credentials and qualifications to be a provider to collect reimbursement. I think that's actually a good thing for the long run and reduces cost in the long run as well. But to answer your question, how are we going to address the workforce shortage in mental health care providers? To your question, sir, I do think that that's an important part of the solution to serve our patients. It's two things. Number one is solve our workforce shortages overall by improving the quality of our schools and creating incentives for those young people to remain in our state. And number two is to make being a mental health care provider a more attractive, including financially attractive profession. People don't go into it just because they're chasing the green pieces of paper. There may be always other professions that will offer more than being a mental health care provider. But I think you should be able to see an attractive career path for that to still be one in which you're able to live a good life reliably without bureaucratic obstacles, to get paid for what you do, to get reimbursed for providing value. And I'm confident that within a couple of years in office, and I don't say this lightly, I think within a couple of years in office, I will personally be able to lead the reforms in this state that ensure more of our young people are graduating with the skills needed to join and be useful in the workforce, and that more of them are choosing a path and a career in being a mental health care provider, and they're able to live a good, financially successful life while doing so with improved reimbursement models. That much I know I can deliver, and if we're successfully elected this November and taking office in January, I think we'll be able to work within a couple of years, if not sooner, to turn that vision into a reality. So thank you for having me today. NAMI, it's an honor to be here.